YouTube after this is over. Again, I'm Tim McAlilly, Senior Cloud Solution Architect here at Microsoft. And there's a little transcription feature I got to turn off on Teams. I got over 24 years in IT and coming up on 11 years with Microsoft, October 2012. I've been with the user group since I believe 2013. I put that on the slide, but I think it was 2013 or maybe 2014. Anyway, I'll be wrapping up with the user group at the end of this calendar year. You hit me up on LinkedIn. I live in the DC suburbs with a wife of 23 years. Yeah, that's right. 23 years. I got to make sure I remember that. 20-year-old daughter in college, and then a 10-year-old daughter going into the fifth grade. I got two cats, and then a 2+-year-old puppy, Labrador puppy named Lily, who you might see behind me. So what are we doing with this workshop? Why are we doing this? I mean, this is already out on GitHub. We'll take a look at the GitHub link here in just a second. But the reason we're doing this is so that we can make sure we get some hands-on on SQL Server, that you can learn more about SQL Server 22. You can download SQL Server 22. You can look at the decks on SQL Server 22 and the documentation and all the different videos and resources. Just plug this into the other bits of knowledge or bits of learning that are already out there for SQL Server 22. That's how I would consider this. And hold on one second. And then that way you can go ahead and just consider this among one of the other resources you can use for learning SQL Server 22. Do this, do that. Got to hear you in the background. Some of the goals for the workshop, again, we want you to make sure you have hands-on SQL Server 22, and you want to think about why you might want to upgrade to SQL Server 22 and learn about specific features of SQL Server 22 and get hands-on experience about 22, and then walk away with, that hands-on knowledge of what SQL Server 22 is all about. I'll shut my camera off here in just a second. The reason I shut my camera off is because I talk with my hands. I always tell that story. Anyway, we're doing these on Fridays, last Friday of the month up through November. And then November will be more of a wrap up, a summary of what we learned. But the module today, we're on module 4, powering our database with security, scalability, and availability. We're breaking that into 2 parts. So we're going to talk about the security enhancements to SQL Server 22, and we'll do a couple of demos, one on Ledger, and then we'll do not even really a demo, just a walkthrough of the different fixed server roles, the added fixed server roles, and then the documentation on the fixed server roles. The next month we'll come and we'll talk about things like the scalability enhancements and the availability enhancements. And then we'll do some demos on those. We'll talk about hands-free TempDB and contained availability groups. Then we'll come in September. We'll talk about data virtualization, object storage, and then module 6. In October, we'll talk about enhancing our applications with the new T-SQL features. And then November 17th will be the wrap up of what we learned. And then after that, I'm handing over the meetup. Also, if you don't know it, we've got an Azure OpenAI ChatGPT Bootcamp. That's an in-person event. I don't know what we're going to do on recording just yet. I think we've got 7 to 8 sessions, single track, 7 to 8 sessions. So one big room, and we'll just break out the time allocations between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And we'll do the standard user group. You'll have snacks and some type of lunch, and I believe some type of raffle giveaway. I'm not exactly sure, but it looks like we've got some sponsors lined up and all that kind of good stuff. And then again, that's going to be the Microsoft Freedom Square office, not our Reston, Virginia office. It's going to be in Reston, Virginia, but there's 2 offices in Reston. So it's going to be at the 11955 Freedom Drive in Reston, Virginia. The second floor, room C, D, and E. For all these meetup sessions that we're doing, you can take a look at the recorded content. We have a SQL Server 22 workshop playlist. If you go to AKA MS/cloud events, you'll see it. And then also the slides for this, as well as the labs, all the scripts, all the materials are out at aka.ms SQL 22 workshop. I'll go there real quick just to kind of show you because I do it on. I want to make sure you know about it. Again, for the meetup sessions, we'll do slides and demos. We got some recorded demos. We don't have Azure passes for Azure labs and all that kind of good stuff, but you can absolutely configure these labs, follow the instructions, and you'll be just fine. For additional resources, the best resource that I've found outside of the SQL Server 22 documentation is the SQL Server 22 Revealed book by Bob Ward. I mean, that's a perfect book. It flows in the same direction as this workshop does. So he has things, he puts color around a lot of the otherwise fairly dry facts around SQL Server. The workshop itself, in terms of how we've broken it into the different modules, this was done by the product group, and we'll go look at the GitHub site here in just 1 second. But if you go and look at it, the GitHub site's broken down into the modules. Intro to SQL Server 22, connecting SQL Server 22 to Azure. That's where we looked at Synapse Link. We looked at Managed Instance Link. We looked at connecting to Azure Active Directory. We looked at Azure Microsoft Purview connectivity. We looked at best practices analyzer, things that connect to Azure to make SQL Server 22 truly a hybrid friendly platform. And then last month we talked about intelligent query processing with things like max degree of parallelism and all the IQP, or the intelligent query processing add-ons. And now this week we're going to talk, or this month and next month we'll talk about security, scalability, and availability to and we'll break that out into 2 different months. And then the module 6, enhancing our module 5, accessing new storage and data virtualization. We'll hit that in September. With the T-SQL capability piece, we'll do that in October, and then we'll wrap up and do Q&A. Real quick, let's go. Let's just to remind you of where this is. Let's go here. Let's go here. Again, if you go to the SQL Server 22 workshop, it's right here. It gives you all the instructions for it gives you basically everything we've already looked at. Business learning objectives and the business applications of the workshop and the technologies that are used, and some things you'll get to, some prerequisites around creating a repo or a clone of this repo, and downloading the scripts for all of the workshops, and the minimum recommended requirements for Linux or Windows hosts, and the versions of SQL Server that you'll need, and the different aspects of the different database backups you'll need. Then the workshop details themselves, and you can go and look in to you can drill into the workshops and see what is being delivered with videos and scripts and walkthroughs, and you can take a look at the individual labs, and you can take a look at where it says Azure Connected, and there's Azure Active Directory and Azure Arc Enabled Server and Managed Instance Link and Purview and Synapse Link, and there are lab scripts and steps right there in GitHub for you to kind of go through. So it's all laid out. So when I say where are you going to go for the slides, you're going to go here for the slides. And you can go into the SQL Server 22 workshop, and you can go into the slides area, and you can download the slides that were updated last month. So that way you'll get the constant updates to the slides. Go here. Quick. All right, I'm going to turn the camera off because, again, I talk with my hands. And we'll jump into kind of a little quick review of where we have come from in terms of the content itself. Hold on 1 second. Here in. So we'll talk about the next steps for SQL Server. Just again, I'll get this a little bit more in by way of review, but we see that SQL Server and how it's been preceded by SQL Server 2016 with enhancements around the query store for looking at in a graphical sense uh, how a query is running on your server, the different statistics, the different CPU and the different durations, how that query is running, and how you can pin a query and use that as a way for you to store information about how queries have run. It's much more graphical than Profiler or extended events, really. It's much more. Uh, in terms of how to use that information, to me, it's more usable than the stuff that's in Activity Monitor. But anyway, Query Store 2016, Polybase in 2016, also where you could create tables that are really mapped to external data sources for HD Insight and Azure SQL Database and blob data on blob storage, how you can connect all that information. Always encrypted, the ability to encrypt a column inside of a table and then have that data decrypted by a .NET driver on the application side, or if you have permission inside of the database. But it's a great way to think about um, a separation of duties, because a SQL Server administrator still might not have a need to see a column of data or data that's in a column for things like salary information or credit card information or other sensitive information that you encrypt. So that's a good way to prevent that. Row level security and dynamic data masking right there. It's where you don't really encrypt data in row level security or dynamic data masking, but you, based on your role and the rows that are being involved in the row level security, you can get a view of that data based on your role. If you're not in the right role and the row level security is enabled, then you don't see the data. You could be a US East or US West manager, and you won't be able to see the data for your the regions that you're not responsible for. But maybe the continental manager, she can see all that data. SQL Server 2016 also ran faster, different usage of storage and processor and memory and different ways to leverage the system. It just made it run faster. Then, expanded options for running the standard edition of SQL Server. And then 2017, we introduced the ability to run workloads on Linux, the same SQL Server source code really, but just runs on Linux, and also to be able to deploy SQL Server into a Docker or a Kubernetes container. And then more with this adaptive query processing where metrics or query plans that are being generated, the query engine, it learns from the queries that are running. It can get better. It adapts to the queries that are being run and improves overall query performance. Same with automatic tuning around taking a look at how your queries are running and then maybe setting up some automatic tuning. Support for the graph database and machine learning services. And then SQL Server 2019, right? Data virtualization, be able to hit a third-party storage source to access data, more intelligent query processing, really building upon that adaptive query processing and building out more capabilities on top of adaptive query processing. Accelerated database recovery to improve things like restores and log throughput, especially for transactional replication and always on availability groups. And then the ability to have data classification inside of the SQL Server engine, where you can have data that you might either need recommendations on what it sees, might need to be classified, or you can do manual classifications for data that you have and build custom classifications. The data classification is it ties in with Microsoft Purview, the big broad enterprise data dictionary, data classification, data glossary system. I know of just the three mere bullets that I mentioned about Microsoft Purview are just that, mere bullets, because Purview does a lot. And then with the SQL capabilities, right? We wanted to make sure you're familiar with the tooling and are used to the flexibility that you have with SQL Server. But we wanted to make sure it covered a range from the intelligent edge all the way up to the cloud. And we've got things like the SQL Server workloads that can run on an IoT device with Azure Edge, and SQL Server that can run on a virtual machine or on a standalone instance, SQL Server 22, or on Linux, or we wanted to have SQL Server installations that tie in with Azure. And we've created the Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. We've installed the Arc agent on SQL Server. And then maybe Azure Arc enabled managed instances, or SQL Server on virtual machine that just has the IaaS agent on it, or Azure SQL managed instance, or the Azure SQL database. And there's so much parity with the T-SQL core of what the relational database management system can process, but just around the fringes, different presentation of these different database platforms. But still, you're able to connect to it with Management Studio or through the Azure portal, etc. And then, sorry about that. Sometimes I go one too far on the slides. And then with SQL Server 22, we have created these hero capabilities, or key capabilities that we want to push the most, right? And one of which was or three of which we talked about in our connecting to Azure, right? The link to managed instance, where you can have an on-prem SQL node that has a replica that is running on an Azure SQL managed instance and fail over and fail back from that configuration. And then Azure Synapse link, where you can have your your SQL Server 22 database be a data store that feeds into a landing zone and ultimately into a SQL pool for Azure Synapse, so that Synapse can pull that near real-time data from your Azure SQL database. And then be able to look at your data estate and also have policies that flow down from Microsoft Purview. By integrating into Purview, if you've got an Arc-enabled SQL Server, you can integrate that into Microsoft Purview, and you can dig into the types of data, the data types, contacts. You can really get some good information about the metadata of the data that's in your database through Purview, but you can also create these policies inside of Purview for read access, or maybe DevOps policies around who can do certain things inside of your databases and who can't. And then very secure. And one of the things we're pushing there is Ledger, which we'll talk about a little bit later in about 5 minutes. And then again, we've got all these enhancements around intelligent query processing. And these will appear in Azure SQL Edge and Azure Arc enabled data services and Azure SQL database on our cloud. And then for the SQL Server 22 capabilities, in addition, sorry about that, I'll go too far on the build out. In addition, or highlighting these features, but wrapping around that hero capability piece, we're very focused on being able to connect to the cloud, linking to managed instance, linking to Azure Synapse, linking to Purview, also incorporating Azure Active Directory and being able to leverage built-in the best practice analyzer that'll tie in with the cloud capabilities, and making sure that you can still back up to a cloud storage. And then built-in query intelligence, security, scalability, and availability. Again, that's this meeting. That's what we're talking about for this month and next month. Data virtualization and object storage. Being able to use things like Amazon S3 as a data source or a storage location for backups. And then being able to leverage the new enhancements to T-SQL, time series data, JSON data, T-SQL, new T-SQL capabilities. All of these are bundled into SQL Server 22. So now let's talk about powering your database with security, scalability, and availability. And we'll talk about security enhancements primarily, but I will hit the slide that shows scalability enhancements and the availability enhancements. Where you see Purvy's list, that's a colleague of Bob Ward's inside of Microsoft, Purvi Shah, and she has this list of things she wants to kind of roll out. So we'll talk about those as well. So for security, some of the things that we pushed out with, Ledger for SQL Server. Ledger is where we're using blockchain technology and creating these tables that record changes, and those tables that record the changes and the data that records the changes is immutable, right? You can't make any changes to it. You can only append to it. It tracks changes, who did the change, when the change happened. Um, but that's called Ledger for SQL Server. It's available for Azure SQL databases as well. And then always encrypted security enhancements, some different things you can now do with keyword usage and things like that. We used to not be able to do joins and comparison operations. You can now do those, so in some cases, with always encrypted. And then being able to connect, right? Strict connections encrypted with TDS, Tabular Data Stream 8.0. Scalable, buffer pool, parallel scan, hands-free TempDB, auto sync updates, or auto sync update stats concurrency, and I'll talk about that next month. And then availability, which we'll also get into next month. We'll do high-level slides around scalability and availability, but contained availability groups and cross-platform snapshot backups. Right, this is cross-platform, meaning AWS, Azure to AWS type thing, and then some of the backup compression technology that's out there. So for security enhancements, the big ones that we're going to talk about today are, Ledger for SQL Server, always encrypted enhancements, the ability to make sure that you've got your protocols, your security connection protocols in place. So in strict connection for encryption, PFX certificate support, new granular security roles, and then enhancements for dynamic data masking. So let's hit these, and then we'll do a demo on Ledger and then do a demo on security roles. So, and again, these are just high level, and I've got a more detailed slides on this in a second. But what is the Ledger in general, right? It provides this tamper. I know I'm reading, but I created these slides are created. It provides these tamper evident capabilities in your database, and you can, make sure that you've got cryptography or encryption on the data source that's tracking on your ledger tables. That's attesting that nobody's been able to make any changes, and you can determine who has done an update statement on your data. Always encrypted enhancements. There had been issues with randomized versus deterministic encryption, right? If you used randomized encryption on your column, it was difficult to do joins and group bys and order by and comparison operations and not having performance impacted. That's alleviated now a little bit, so you can do joins, group bys, order bys with your text columns. And there is some improvement on that. So for both randomized and deterministic, and that's a big deal, right? Because with deterministic encryption, it's where you can generally, again, it's encryption, so it's not necessarily and obviously determined, a pattern that you can ascertain, but you can maybe see where a pattern is developed in deterministic encryption. With randomized encryption, it's completely random. You don't see any pattern. But you would use deterministic encryption if you had a credit card or social security column and you needed to do comparisons between those, and it was a frequent set of comparisons. You might use deterministic encryption for that particular column, which means you can use it in your join and compare type and union type operations. Well, now you can also use the randomized to get more protection. Strict connected encryption with tabular data stream 8.0 and transport layer security 1.3. It makes that encryption mandatory for if you're using TDS and TLS, and then aligns the Microsoft tabular data stream with your HTTPS, and makes it more manageable for network appliances to add additional security. And it removes the Microsoft TDS, TLS custom interleaving. That's maybe custom workarounds, and then enables the usage of TLS 1.3 and then TLS and subsequent TLS protocol versions. What that means is it'll support the latest version of the internet's most deployed security protocol and its subsequent versions. PFX certificate support. So again, there's new support for import and export of PFX formatted certificates and private keys. Again, what a PFX certificate, a personal information exchange certificate. It's a file format used to store and transport digital certificates. There's also the ability to back up and restore master keys to Azure Blob Storage. Your SQL Server generated certificates now have a default RSA key size of 3072 bits. And there's added a backup symmetric key and restore symmetric key functionality. There are now new granular fixed server roles. We'll take a look at the documentation and we'll take a look at the roles themselves. It's not, I have a slide that says demo. It just means we're going out to take a look. And then there's new enhancements for dynamic data masking. Mainly that's your more granular permission sets for unmasking, right? That's if you have dynamic data masking, but you want to remove it for a user or group or a role, and you can unmask so that someone can see the data that would otherwise be masked. How about that? I had a piece of cherry skin in my teeth. Anyway, so for Ledger for SQL Server, right? If you want to track the record of your data over time and want to make sure that it's you can see if there's been any tampering or evidence, you also want to prevent that, right? You want the power of blockchain in a centralized system like SQL Server, where you could use a cryptologically hashed ledger to detect tampering by malicious actors, and it's built into SQL Server with a T-SQL function. Establish your digital trust in a centralized system using blockchain technology. Attest to other parties that data integrity has not been compromised, that you can prove it to an audit team. And then you get that automatic digest storage, right? So if you were a bank and you had an updatable table that was marked as a ledger table, and you could get a historical view of that table. There's also a view of the ledger itself, so you can see what changes have been done, and you can get basically blockchain that's doing the cryptographic hashing of that ledger digest to make sure that any updates absolutely tracked, any change is absolutely tracked, and that is stored in trusted storage so that no one can manipulate the ledger source. And then if a bank regulator or an auditor was to take a look, they could see the trusted storage and do a comparison to the database ledger. And then in terms of how to use Ledger for SQL Server, you create a ledger table, updatable or append only, and then make your changes to your data, insert, updates, deletes, only if the table's updatable. And you can take a look at the ledger history. Then you save those changes manually or automatically to a ledger digest, and you go ahead and generate reports or some process to do ledger verification. And then some questions, how is this different from a temporal table? Again, this has built-in transaction auditing. It's append only. And then, database ledger and the digest are used for tampering evidence. How's it different from SQL Server audit? It's got transaction history and your audit are built into a database. And it's also captured in the digest information. And you can also go in and verify the digest. That's not such a wide stretch around what you would do differently from SQL Server audit, right? You can pull data from files because you can save your SQL Server audit information to an event log or a file on a file source, and you can, much like you can with the digest that's also stored separately onto a file system. Can I disable ledger from a table, right? You can't alter a table to turn off the ledger, and then you can't turn off system versioning. So once you start the ledgering, it really, you'd probably have to drop the table altogether and rebuild it. And then can I drop a ledger table? Yeah, but you still get a history of that drop table, and you get a record of the ledger itself and having been in existence. And then how often do I need to save? Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. How often do I need to save the digest, right? As frequently as you need to ensure that the ledger is tamper-proof. There's sort of an auto-save mechanism. And does the ledger require more space, right? If it's updatable, it'll require similar space requirements as temporal tables. Plus, that ledger requires some minimal extra storage space because it's storing your hashes and your blockchain information. And then your digest, it's small and separate, but you might need to keep a long history for your whatever compliance requirements your organization has. And you can't archive or truncate ledger tables in the database ledger. And then is there any performance impact? And again, it's append only, minimal impact. Updatable would have similar impact as a temporal table. And then some other limits, right? In-memory tables aren't supported. Sparse column sets aren't supported. For partitioning information, a switch in and out isn't supported. Ledger tables can't have full text indexes. They can't be graph tables. They can't be file tables. Your ledger tables can't have a row stored, non-clustered index when they have a clustered column store index. Change tracking isn't allowed on the history table, but it's allowed on the ledger tables. Change data capture isn't supported on ledger tables. And then transactional replication isn't supported for ledger tables. So let's take a look at the ledger, and then we'll take a look at the fixed server roles. Let's go here. Actually, let's do real quick the fixed server roles. That's not a long lab, but it's not a long demo at all. So the fixed server roles, again, introduced here in SQL Server 22. You've got some server roles. Oh, let's go to the lab real quick. So for your fixed server roles, you have your server roles, and it's database connector, or really it's, let me drag this over to me so you can see it a little bit clearer. Oh, Zoom, it doesn't work on I don't have Zoom installed here. But you can go in and look at, you can look at your server roles on your server level, and you see the pound MS database connector, MS database manager, definition reader, login manager, etc. And these are new fixed server roles that allow you to do a couple of different things. And there's also some other roles down there: SQL IaaS extension, backup, instance setting, reporting, storage config, and troubleshooting. But we're not so concerned about that right now. We're concerned about these. And let's go take a look at what these fixed server roles do. And again, they're introduced here. Bring this up again. These fixed server roles let you help manage permission on the server. Again, but in the new fixed server roles help you do additional things. You might have certain things like MS database connector, and they can connect to any database without requiring a user account in the database to connect to. Or MS_login manager, create, delete, modify logins. How does that differ from the security admin role? It doesn't allow members to grant privileges. It's a more limited role. It helps to comply with the principles of least privilege. And then database managers can create and delete databases. Server state manager, same permissions as the server state reader. It holds the alter server state permission, which allows access to several management operations around your different DBCCs. Server performance state reader. It can take a look at certain DMVs. Again, it's following the principle of least privilege. Definition reader can read the catalog views that are covered by any view definition, and respectively has view definition permission. And then I'm not reading all of these, but security definition reader, can read all the catalog views that are covered by view any security definition and respectively has view security definition permission on any database in which the member of the role has the account. And it's a small subset of what the definition reader has to promote that principle of least privilege. And this shows a quick table here of what they can do just at a high level for the server and a database level for all the way from MS database connector all the way down to MS security definition reader. And you can see these roles here, and then you can also see them inside of your SQL Server security server roles, and then you can see the new fixed server roles. All right, well, let's take a look real quick at a couple of different demos for Ledger. I'm sorry, guys. Let's scooch back. You got your data here. Get your temperature by responsibility, Contoso East Shipping, ice cream, Contoso West Shipping, Dahlia Paleo Farms, and ice cream shop, Australia. You got your data. You got your temperature reading. I'm assuming that's Celsius. I'm not sure what. Yeah, temperature reading 10 degrees Celsius. Then you got your ledger, your trusted supply chain. You got your append only ledger table shipment where you're creating a table with ledger on, and this is append only. You could also do updates as well. So ledger on, append only, but this is just a basic table with a temperature integer and out of compliant bit type. And you've got your reading here for a temperature. So we're going to do some modified data. It's out of compliant. Got a DBA, knows it asks to manipulate data since the company made a mistake, wants to avoid huge claims. DBA tries to manipulate the faulty record, but notice it's an append only ledger table and data can't be modified. So update shipments, temperature 0. So it wants to do an update to the table, and then boom, updates are not allowed for the append only ledger table shipments. So that'll show up that update was attempted, right? So it doesn't happen in like a vacuum. So updatable ledger table shipping methods, again, system versioning on, ledger on. And you can also view the history of the ship method table. So you want to pull from the ship method ledger table. And you've got the different records for pulling information. You've got who did it, and you've got a record of the commit times, and you've got a record of what was done, inserts and deletes. Now I mentioned the digest himself. The digest is the encrypted digest of the record, right? This digest text, digest TXT. So he wants to verify that the database can be trusted. So SP verify manual digest. So ledger verification successfully verified. So now let's tamper with the data. So again, select top 10 records from the data. From shipments, where shipment ID is 312. So we want to copy the ID from the previous results set. So we've got page ID, and we've got the out of compliance, and we've got, we want to execute some tampering activity. We want to make sure we do some kind of tamper with the temperature. Then we want to, again, we want to see what's not compliant in our record. Is anything there? Then we're going to verify the database again. And then it's given us a warning. Say the computed hash from shipments and the associated history does not match the hash persisted in the sys database ledger transactions for the transaction 413 that failed. The verification failed. And then we can review the history of the transaction. Again, where the transactions 413 from both the error and from the statement here. And then we can see what's going on. There was an insert that was attempted here on shipment ID 312 on Contoso e-shipping, where temperature was -1 and out of compliance is 0. So that's the quick demo on that. And if you go out onto the virtual machine, well, if you go and take a look at the lab, oh, excuse me. If you go and take a look at the lab, hold on one second. Sorry, I had to make sure my virtual machine wasn't out too big for my actual actual machine. Sorry about that. If you go and take a look at the labs, you can see for the SQL Server 20, I downloaded a zip file called SQL Server 22 Workshop. It created this subdirectory here, Azure Connected Built-in Intelligence Engine, which we're in, Datavert, T-SQL. If you go into Engine, and you can see that for the SQL Ledger, there's all these scripts for these labs. You create a database and create the ledger and create the digest and do some activity. And you can go in and basically gives you full sets of instructions on how to do that. So I encourage you to do that. Another kind of a walkthrough for this, and you can open this up with Azure Data Studio. You get a Jupyter notebook called Ledger here inside of this SQL Ledger subdirectory. You can go and run this demo. You can go and select the version. It'll tell you the SQL Server 22, and you can do DBA query catch. So after Bob updates the salary of his friends to see what the ledger says, the query looks at the most recent ledger entries for employees. So it'll pull back that information, and you can take a look at commit time and the user and what was done, insert or delete. That's that. Hold on one second. There we go. And then you can also take a look at an application catch. Again, this query is going to show that the ledger, that the app updates Jay's salary, but Bob doesn't know what we've written to the app to audit the SQL commands using another ledger table. And the table shows that Flynn was the app user who initiated the update. So again, using Contoso HR, you're doing these selects from employee ledger. You're joining it on the ledger transactions, and it'll pulling in timestamp, username query, and the transaction ID and the sequence number. It's going to pull back. Commit time, the app name, the employee ID, SSN, first name, Adam, right? Insert or delete. And then the additionally is going to take a query that's run by Flynn, timestamp, username Flynn, query, the exact query that was run, the ledger ID, and the ledger start sequence. Then also you can also generate a database digest. There's a SP generate database ledger digest, and it'll tell you where the ledger is. Where's that ledger? Oops, sorry, I think I screwed this up here. Go back here. Anyway, it generates ledger information. So Bob's going to run a stored procedure to supposedly verify employees, but we're suspicious, so we'll check the employee table in the ledger. You can see here that he pulled back, we looked at employee ID, SSN, first name, last name, salary. So we can see that Bob actually was looking at the salary information. And then also you can catch a hidden system table update where you do alter database, set, allow snapshot isolation to on, use Contoso HR. There's some database information and the information you're going to pull back from the ledger. And it's going to give you an error. It's going to say, hey, the hash computed from the ledger transactions doesn't match the hash persisted in the ledger blocks, and the ledger verification failed. So again, there's another one here. Bob verified employees again using his normal procedure. This time the verification is going to show how the save digest doesn't match the digest stored in the system table. And this is a true verification for the digest saved off in another trusted location. Again, it'll show you, hold on, let me pull this down a little bit. Again, it'll show you the hash block of 0 of the database ledger. Does it match? And then it'll show you that the ledger verification failed because he's trying to check to make sure that this new store procedure worked and trying to verify his ledger table. And again, you can pull this up. This is a good walkthrough that you can pull up from the lab subdirectory for SQL Ledger. There's a Jupyter notebook. There's a README file. I opened it with WordPad that'll walk you through using all these scripts. And go off and try it. Go off and try SQL Ledger and read about the other security enhancements and kind of get your hands dirty. All right, guys. Is there any questions before we wrap up? We're going to wrap up a little bit early. No? Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and shut the recording off, and I am going to go to North Carolina on vacation